Mr. President, I just want to join my colleague from Ohio, Senator Brown, in his message about our responsibilities to do our job. It's very simple. Do our job. Do what the people of our state elected us to do. Senator Brown is absolutely correct. In Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, it states, the President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. The last time I checked, the President was elected for a term of 4 years, not 3 years, 2 months. We still have 10 months left of President Obama's presidency. There is plenty of time for the Senate to consider his nomination for the Supreme Court of the United States. I find it shocking that my colleagues would suggest, even before the President has submitted a nomination, that the Senate would not conduct hearings or consider the nomination of the President to the Supreme Court, even though that is our constitutional responsibility, and even though we were elected for a 6-year term. And the last time I checked, we were in session to the end of this year. We don't adjourn in March of the year. We have 10 months left in office. The President does, and senators will. We should do our work, do our job. I think the American people will ultimately demand that the Senate does its job and not threaten to stop working simply to coddle and pander to the most extreme and fringe elements of its base. Senators should look at the Constitution and history and the precedents of the Senate on how to proceed. And I say that, Mr. President, because if we do not hold a hearing on President Obama's nomination for the Supreme Court, it'll be the first time in the history of the United States that a nominee who requested a hearing is denied a hearing. The first time ever. This is a matter of what is the appropriate role in the Constitution of the United States. We all took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And it's our responsibility to respond with a serious effort. The majority leader said that when we get a nomination, we should act with dignity. Well, we're not acting with dignity if we don't hold a hearing. Let me remind you that the last time a president nominated in an election year of the opposite party, President Reagan's nomination of Justice Kennedy was considered by the Democratic-controlled Senate and approved by the Democratic-controlled Senate. And let me also remind you, there have been times where nominees of the president have not been approved by the Judiciary Committee. They have still come to the floor of the United States Senate for action. Justice Thomas was approved by a majority of vote of the Senate, even though he was not recommended by the Judiciary Committee, and it was short of the 60-vote threshold, which means that if the Democrat majority wanted to filibuster, they could, but it has never been filibustered, a nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. So we're in uncharted waters here, what the Republicans are doing. We have separation of branches of government. That's the history of our country. That's the democracy in which we live in. It's our responsibility to preserve that. We, the legislative branch of the government, have the responsibility to advise and consent. Independent judiciary. The Supreme Court operates with 9 justices, not with 8. It is an abuse of power of the majority in the United States Senate, the Republicans, to say that we're going to reduce the Supreme Court of the United States to 8 by inaction. And what happens when you have conflicting decisions made by different circuits? And the only court that can determine the law is the Supreme Court in its interpretation. And they're 4-4 deadlocked. If we do not take up this appointment and we go the full year into next year, it would be 2 terms of the United States Supreme Court without the full complement of justices. Mr. President, do your job, my colleagues. It's all we have to do. You don't have to vote yes. Vote. Have a hearing. Have the courage to vote yes or no on the president's nominee. And you're saying we're not even going to get a chance for a hearing or vote, and we don't even know who the nominee is. That's just plain wrong. And I think the American people will speak with a clear voice and say that that is just not what the United States senators should be doing. And I hope that the leadership, the Republican leadership, will provide the dignity of the United States Senate, hold hearings, and allow the full Senate to vote up or down on the president's nominee for the Supreme Court. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.